information. Yes? What's that? Everything between the first exam and that date. So there will be a sheet. There will be a sheet about the second exam eventually, just like there was for the first. So the concentration is going to be on dinosaurian diversity. That will also include the rise of the dinosaurs and something about their ecological history. So, all right. So, hopefully you're all caught up with the the recorded part from the end of last lecture, where I covered the two giant groups, or groups of giants, in the basal part of Tetanurae, that is Spinosaurids among the Megalosauroids, and then the clade Carnosauria. Today, we're covering the best part of Dinosauria of all, which are the primitive parts of Coelurosauria. So, Coelurosauria. Remember that I talked about how we had, in Tetanurae, there were the Megalosauroids, and then this group Theropoda. Within Theropoda, there were the Carnosauria, Allosaurus and kin, and then there's Coelurosauria, which is the group we start now and continue throughout next week. Now, the name Coelurosauria is kind of a not super helpful name. It's the Coelurus lizards, and Coelurus itself was one of the first discovered fossil Coelurosaurs. The name itself means hollow tail. It's a late Jurassic theropod genus and probably a primitive tyrannosaur. So they're a group of avitheropod tetanurians. The oldest Coelurosaurs are from the Middle Jurassic, and they survive ever since. And ancestrally, Coelurosaurs are carnivorous dinosaurs. But as we will see, many are non-carnivores. And starting by the time, hopefully I'll get to the end, at the end of this lecture, we'll get to forms which are markedly not carnivorous, and that will become the norm for the rest of the dinosaurian diversity. So here's our look at Coelurosaurian history. So we saw carnosaurs go back to the beginning of the Middle Jurassic, and Coelurosaurs seem to as well. So same general part of the tree. And the groups we'll actually be covering today will be this part of the tree down here all the way up through here. So this part of the tree we'll deal with on Monday, and then a subgroup in here we're going to deal with on Wednesday. So lots of information in this part of the tree. It's a highly studied area. And again, we're going to be covering Tyrannosauroids and Ornithomimosaurs are the main focus of today's lecture. So, what makes a Coelurosaur a Coelurosaur? Well, there's a lot of traits, but here's an interesting one. When we get to Coelurosauria, the brain has increased in size relative to other theropods of the same body size. Now, that's kind of, it's not super huge, at least not yet. But it's bigger than it was before. So we will see a series of such expansions later on. In fact, I should be able to get to the next expansion before the end of today's lecture, and then we'll see a later one on Wednesday. So here's sort of a generic early Coelurosaur, position uncertain, but maybe will be narrowed down. We'll find out next week. And by that is there's a presentation about it that's going to be coming up soon. So Coelurosaurs, relative to even their cousins, the Carnosaurs, have relatively long, narrow hands, slender hands. So Carnosaurs, Megalosauroids have fairly long hands, but they're sort of broad. In Coelurosaurs, they're generally relatively skinny. Their foot tends to be long and slender, but that's probably a consequence of the small body size of most of them. We saw last time that the Tetanurians get their name by the interlocking tail, the stiffened tail. But in Coelurosaurs, we have an additional aspect to them. Not only do they have those big forward prongs to hold the tail in place better, but the chevrons, at least in the posterior part of the tail, are shaped like little kayaks. Remember the chevrons? Those are the bones that hang underneath the tail vertebrae. And normally they're shaped like this, like these, from a point, from a straight on, and sort of straps from the side. In Coelurosaurs, they become these little kayak shapes. And that's sort of stiffening the tail from below. And it's in Coelurosauria that we first found protofeathers. Now, I talked about last time that we now have protofeathers in megalosauroids, if indeed Cyranemus is a megalosauroid. And we saw before that there's fuzz, which is presumably protofeather fuzz, in some of the ornithischians. But in 1995, 96, around then, this specimen was described, and it's a pretty standard primitive coelurosaur, but it was found in an environment with very, very fine-grained sediment. It's actually a sediment derived from volcanic ash in a lake deposit from northeastern China, and those sites have since yielded the vast majority of our fuzzy or feathered dinosaurs. And it showed that on the outside of the body was not just scales, but rather down-like structures. It's like bird down. So what we call plumulose structures, rather than pennaceous. So pennaceous feathers are what we think of when you think of a feather, you think of a pennaceous feather. Something with a central shaft, branches coming off that, little sub-branches coming off that, etc., that holds a shape together. This looks more like hair or fuzz. So what is this protofeather? What are these protofeathers for? Well, in part maybe for insulation, to keep heat within the body. In part perhaps for display. Those aren't mutually exclusive functions. And we'll talk more about protofeather evolution as time goes by. So primitive coelurosaurs are sort of boringly generic, at least the majority of them. So here's Bicentenaria, named not after our bicentennial. There is a dinosaur that is named after the US bicentennial, and that's Marchosaurus bicentissimus. This is named after the bicentennial of Argentina. And although it occurs fairly late in coelurosaur history, or at least in the Cretaceous, it's anatomically very similar to what we expect a primitive coelurosaur to look like. It's shown about life size, so you see it's a smallish animal. And indeed, many of the basal coelurosaurs are relatively small, and some will get smaller. Here, Compsognathus, this is a very small animal. The compies show up in Jurassic Park, the Jurassic Park movies. It's sort of a mixture of both a coelophysoid, Procompsognathus, and Compsognathus, which is a coelurosaur. These guys are were for a long time considered the smallest dinosaurs, but even when we just exclude birds from that, there are plenty that are smaller now. But sort of a chicken to turkey-sized body here. Now, there is within, probably, the basal part of Coelurosauria, a really confusing group. I say it's a confusing group because where exactly they fit in the family tree has been very uncertain. So the name of the group is Megaraptora, the big raptors. Initially, the public considered them to be giant dromaeosaurs. Dromaeosaurs are the true raptors. We'll get to them next week. Under the misinterpretation of one of their thumb claws as being a toe claw, which the raptors are famous for. Then when we first recognized that Megaraptora was a group that included more than Megaraptor, it looked like maybe they were a type of megalosauroid, which made sense because remember, megalosauroids are characterized by giant thumb claws. Then it appeared they might have been carnosaurs. So slender carnosaurs related to the allosauroids that I talked about, probably a type of allosauroid that I talked about on the recorded lecture. But now, all the phylogenies are finding them in the basal part of Coelurosauria, and at least some of them putting them within the best dinosaurs, the Tyrannosauroids. But with a very different body plan than the Tyrannosaurids that will be the main focus of today's lecture. So these are very lightly built animals. They have gigantically huge claws. They're from the Cretaceous, and in the late part of the late Cretaceous, they're limited to Gondwana, to the southern continents. So we now actually are getting more and more specimens of Megaraptoran. So here's one from Australia, Australovenator. Here we see the reconstruction of Australovenator above, and Murus raptor below, a South American one. And you can see they're relatively lightly built. They've got this huge thumb claws. Those are probably their primary killing weapon. the teeth would obviously help too. Basically, the skulls are sort of lightly built. They're not really powerful skulls. Here is a juvenile specimen of Megaraptor. What's in white is what's found, and actually it definitely has some similarities to Tyrannosaurs. So it's not a crazy idea that they're part of Tyrannosauroidea. Here's a new reconstruction of Megaraptor itself. So, kind of cool creatures. But we don't know as much about them as we'd like. In contrast, we know a lot about this group. So, Tyrannosauroidea. Tyrannosauroidea, the tyrant lizards. That's what the name means. Oldest tyrannosauroids are in the Middle Jurassic. Some of the oldest known coelurosaurs. The last tyrannosauroids are at the very, 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 very tail end of the Cretaceous. Now, tyrannosauroids begin like typical coelurosaurs as small-bodied predators. But throughout their history, different types of tyrannosauroids produce different larger-bodied predators. If the megaraptorins, for instance, are tyrannosauroids, that would be one independent radiation of big predators. And most famously, in the late Cretaceous, the Tyrannosauroidea includes the gigantic, world-famous Tyrannosauridae, represented by things like Tyrannosaurus itself, the creature that gave the whole clade its name. All right. So, this is relevant to my interests. As I mentioned in the very, very beginning of the course, this is my area of expertise. And it's not merely this is the main area of study. This is the area for which I am a world expert. I literally wrote the chapter on it in the current edition, although the third one's coming out, of what's called the Dinosauria, sort of the Bible of dinosaur studies. So, and although I do talk about other topics as well, some of my fans out there in the dank areas of the internet have produced memes like this, so every talk by me. Okay, so what are tyrannosaurs? Well, for a very long time, the only tyrannosaurs that we knew actually to be tyrannosaurs were these guys, the Tyrannosaurids, which are this late Cretaceous group. And the origin of Tyrannosaurids was a bit of a mystery in the pre-Cladistic days. Some people have this hypothesis, and it wasn't crazy given the general information, that Tyrannosaurids were basically carnosaurs grown huge. And at that time, megalosaurs were unquestionably considered part of Carnosauria. So you could see a sort of a general trend of increasing, they're not shown to scale, but increasing body size, of reduction of the arm length, increasing skull size perhaps, increasing hip size, etc. And so the idea that tyrannosaurs were simply the culmination of bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger carnivorous dinosaurs wasn't crazy. But even the person who named Carnosauria noticed that anatomically there were many features in the skeleton of tyrannosaurids which were much more similar to the small-bodied coelurosaurs that were known at the time. And so this is what I called the Tyrannoraptor hypothesis, that Tyrannosaurids were small-bodied carnivorous dinosaurs grown huge, independently of the allosaurs and the megalosaurs and so forth. And so these ideas had been kicked around since sort of the early days of the 20th century. It wasn't until the cladistic studies of the 1980s and 90s that we sorted this out. And indeed, we showed, I and others independently, that Tyrannosaurids were nested within Coelurosauria. So there's some of these small-bodied carnivorous dinosaurs. They do not have a particularly close relationship with megalosauroids or allosaurs. And indeed, that Tyrannosaurids shared a more recent common ancestor with modern birds than they did with Allosaurus or Megalosaurus. They're more closely related to birds than they were to the other groups of giant theropods. So what makes a Tyrannosauroid a Tyrannosauroid? At the time we were working back then, in the 80s and 90s, all we had was Tyrannosauridae. We didn't recognize that there were Jurassic and early Cretaceous theropods, which had already been discovered in some cases, that were part of this lineage, And what we needed were new specimens that sort of filled in those gaps. And then we could see this history. And it does show that those initial cladistic analyses were correct, that tyrannosaurs are coelurosaurs. Well, one of the tyrannosauroid, so the larger group features, is the nasals are fused. I talked about on the recorded lecture how carnosaurs and other primitive theropods have unfused nasals. That's a primitive trait. But in tyrannosaurs, even in early tyrannosauroids, even in really small forms, those nasals are fused together. They're a single bone, or functionally a single bone. And that actually is going to help to strengthen up the snout. Also, unlike most carnivorous dinosaurs, or most dinosaurs in general, the premaxillary teeth are really distinctly different from the maxillary and dentary teeth. In fact, they have this sort of U-shaped, capital U shape in cross-section, although if you put a bar across the top of the U. And they're essentially incisors. Most dinosaurs don't have incisors. They don't have premaxillary teeth that are radically different in size and shape than the maxillary or the dentary teeth, but tyrannosaurs do. In fact, when the first premaxillary teeth of tyrannosaurids were found, it wasn't certain they were from dinosaurs. And O.C. Marsh, when he had found some, thought they were actually from some otherwise unknown pig-sized mammals from the Cretaceous. Turned out he was wrong, but they are incisor-like, and mammals have incisors. So looking down, well, here's one of these premaxillary teeth. And we can see in cross-section this sort of capital U shape. Here's a bunch of them actually in place, and then the sockets for where they've fallen out of place. And we can compare these to the premaxillary teeth this is an abelisaur. These are other carnivorous dinosaurs, and you can see they don't have this same sort of cross-section. In contrast, though, we'll see that tyrannosaurids will have very different maxillary and dentary teeth, but we're not there yet. So within Tyrannosauroidea, the last several decades have greatly expanded our knowledge of this transition from really early coelurosaurs to T-Rex and company. Guanlong, for instance, is one of our best known early tyrannosauroids. It's sort of a medium-sized predator, although on the smallish size, so 3-4 meters long or so. It's got the fused nasals, but it's back in the earliest part of the late Jurassic. And as I talked about last lecture, a lot of theropods at that time tend to have crests, and tyrannosauroids were no exception. It is a single midline crest. It's got those incisor-like premaxillary teeth. It's got something radically different that later tyrannosaurs, or the tyrannosaurids will have. And look at that arm. Really nice, long, strong arm, grasping a hand, exactly like tyrannosaurids don't. Tyrannosaurids, as we'll talk about, are infamous for having those dinky little arms. These guys, no, they have the ancestral coelurosaur grasping arms. And there's the skull of the larger specimen of Guanlong. Some closely related forms to Guanlong actually did become giants. This is Eutyrannus, the beautiful tyrant, from later in the Cretaceous, which is getting up there. Adults of this animal are on sort of the 1.4 ton scale, so they're big theropods, or big-ish. Here's a skull of one. And the cool thing about these specimens, one of the cool things, other than the fact that they're really complete, is that these were found in an environment that preserves the body impressions, and they've got hair, fuzz. They got fuzz about 10 centimeters long or so, 4 inches, and maybe even longer than that in some cases. So they were covered by fairly sizable amounts of fuzz, which we'd expect in that part of the family tree. We move up the family tree a little bit in tyrannosaurs, and we get to creatures that still have long, powerful arms with slender, grasping hands, but the skulls are getting even more heavily built. So we're getting a little more emphasis on the bite force. And in this part of the tree, we have the first discovery of the fuzzy tyrannosaurs. When this came out in 2004, we were super excited about it because it was a dinosaur predicted by science. A small-bodied tyrannosauroid with a fuzzy body covering. And this is little Dilong, the emperor dragon of China. A small body, an adult, this is like the size of an adult individual as projected here. Small body, fast moving, definitely not an apex predator. In its environment, it's going to get wolfed down by other animals in its environment. But it's a harbinger of things to come. It's getting more powerful skull. And so when we map out the presence of these fuzzy integuments, fuzzy body covering, we can see that even the giant tyrannosaurids would be inferred to have had fuzzy body covering at least ancestrally. In contrast, feathery feathers, that is, pennaceous feathers, true, honest-to-goodness feathers in the modern style, they're limited to this branch over here. So tyrannosaurids would not have been feathered in that context, but they would have been fuzzy, at least ancestrally, and possibly even in terms of their actual body covering. So, some artists have put fuzz on their drawings of tyrannosaurids, like Tyrannosaurus. We don't have a positive confirmation of that yet. We do have positive confirmation that at least large parts of Tyrannosaurus had scales on them, although actually relatively small scales compared to hadrosaurids and especially to horned dinosaurs, ceratopsids from the same environment. But as modern and fossil birds and other dinosaurs show, you can actually have scales and fuzz in the same parts of the body, and the environments in which these guys have been preserved is incapable of showing fuzz. So we actually just don't know. It's a question mark. Maybe, but maybe not. We just don't know. Now, some people suggest that maybe the young were covered with more fuzz, and as they got older, they simply didn't get any more fuzz, so they got progressively less fuzzy. Not crazy. That's what happens with elephants. Baby elephant's a lot hairier animal than the adults. Basically, as they grow, they don't add any new hair follicles in between the old ones. So we just don't know what the body covering of big tyrannosaurids were. So in the 21st century, we've added a lot new information about the relationships among tyrannosauroids. So we found that some groups that we already knew about to one degree or other are actually types of tyrannosauroid, and others we just didn't know about, and they have filled in the gaps. And so we now have this sort of phylogeny transition to the true tyrannosaurids. And we see, throughout their history, an increasing emphasis on the skull. This is more important than the bullet points. So just telling that. I said, there is a tendency, I totally get it. So I totally get it. You see bullet points, you think those are the ones you have to write down. Sometimes it's the charts that are more important. Just throwing that out there. Okay, so increasing emphasis on the skull. So the head becomes not only the way they feed, but also how they kill their prey. And consequently, a decreased emphasis on the forelimb. The forelimb is becoming essentially useless, at least as prey handling. And this is less well appreciated by sort of the general public and by paleontologists who don't pay attention. The increasing running ability, cursorial ability. Now, running ability doesn't necessarily mean speed, but it means adaptations for moving quickly in some fashion, and we'll see some of those aspects of that coming up. So, Tyrannosaur history marked by increasing emphasis on the skull, decreasing emphasis on the forelimb, increasing emphasis on running ability. In the last several years, we began to add sort of intermediate grade forms that show the transition to the tyrannosaur type body plan, Tyrannosaurid body plan, but at a small body size. And I've called these forms the Coyotes of the Cretaceous, and in fact, my colleagues used that phrase in the name Suski tyrannus, which is, in Zuni language, coyote, so the coyote tyrant. So here, this shows us some of the representatives at this part of the tree. So here's Moros, an adult Moros, probably how it would look. So a good-sized animal to you or I, but tiny as a predatory animal. There's much larger carcharodontosaurs in this environment that would have eaten it. And here we could see this little Suski tyrannus compared to just the dentary of Tyrannosaurus rex. But we see in animals like this, Well, among other things, great reduction of the forelimb, and other traits which we'll get to momentarily. It's interesting, at least it's interesting to me, that it co-occurs in the same environment as the almost but not quite ceratopsid Zuniceratops and the almost but not quite hadrosaurid Jawadi. So it's like it's the dress rehearsal for the end of the age of dinosaurs. A almost tyrannosaurid, an almost ceratopsid, an almost hadrosaurid, which would soon be replaced by their more derived descendants. Now, it's at this stage in the history of tyrannosaurids that we get the origin of a really important trait in the foot called an arctometatarsus. And there'll be slides to come where we're going to look at those in more detail. A pinched third metatarsal. So as we get into the later part of the late Cretaceous, there are some forms which sort of transition between creatures like Moros and Siskityrannus and the true tyrannosaurids. They're getting bigger, so 6 to 8 meters long, good-sized animals. Even greater reduction of the arm length. This continued elongation of the hind limbs. The hind limbs are getting longer, and these guys definitely have this arctometatarsus, this pinched third metatarsal structure. And where we know their skulls, in the case of the back of the skull of Zhangguanlong, they're beginning to get the super powerful bite that will characterize Tyrannosaurids. Okay, so this is, time has been knocked on its side, so these Tyrannosauroids and their outgroups still have longish arms. Over here, we're getting forms with short arms at the end of Tyrannosaurid history. Okay, so just to give an example here, there is recently recognized a clade of, only known from a couple different individuals, of eastern North American tyrannosaurs, the Dryptosaurids, of which Dryptosaurus is our best example. However, no specimens anywhere near this complete. The Dryptosaurus itself is from New Jersey, but other fragments have been found elsewhere in the east. And it looks like Dryptosaurids are close to, but not actually in, Tyrannosauridae. So here we are, the culmination of the course. Tyrannosauridae, a group of giant theropods, 10 to 13 meters long. Okay, there's a couple genera that actually shrink a bit. And they're from the late Cretaceous, in fact, the late Cretaceous of Asia and North America. Hey, we've heard that before. Where were ceratopsids from? The late Cretaceous of Asia and North America. How about ankylosaurines? Ditto. How about pachycephalosaurs? Ditto. How about the vast majority of hadrosaurids? Ditto. These are the last group of large-bodied theropods to evolve. Other groups had arisen earlier. And they're highly specialized in their anatomy. And they're also evolution's way of saying, you're so screwed. So all those groups that I mentioned here, Tyrannosaurids, ceratopsids, the vast diversity of hadrosaurids, pachycephalosaurs, and ankylosaurines, are all from the same region, Western North America and Eastern and Central Asia, which were connected at the time by a land bridge over what now is Alaska and Siberia. In contrast, Eastern North America, we had earlier branches of hadrosaurids and hadrosaurs and earlier branches of tyrannosauroids in our region. And then the rest of the world is dominated by abelusaurids and titanosaurs. And this is the late part of the late Cretaceous. We'll talk more about geography of dinosaurs in a lecture to come. Tyrannosaurids, of course, infamously gigantic. And when this particular graphic was first shown at the International Conference, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, Pete Makovicki, the guy who was describing this new form in gray, said, and there's Tom Holtz, the measure of all things Tyrannosaurs. So, I'm not making this up, guys, okay? And so here's another way of showing this, the evolution of larger body size in Tyrannosaurids. And which co-occurs with the evolution of larger body size in ceratopsids, and is almost certainly not a coincidence. It is almost certainly co-evolution, an evolutionary arms race. Now, were Tyrannosaurids the biggest theropods of all time? Well, Tyrannosaurus itself dwarfs most other Tyrannosaurids, so it's the measure for Tyrannosauridae. And at the moment, the studies for dinosaur body mass puts the largest specimen of Tyrannosaurus rex, so specimens called Sue and Scotty from South Dakota and Saskatchewan, respectively, as marginally larger than very fragmentary specimens of the giant Carcharodontosaur allosaur, Giganotosaurus. But notice, in this particular study, Scott Hartman found that Sue massed about 8.4 tons, and the largest Giganotosaurus at 8.2 tons. So that's a difference of only 200 kilograms, 440 pounds. For animals of this size, that's one meal. So the real statement there is these are animals of approximately the same size. So it looks like they're, technically speaking, Tyrannosaurids are the largest known theropods, but practically speaking, especially given the very low sample size in this part of the tree, they max out at essentially the same body size. For adults, but of course creatures don't spend their whole lives as adults, and as we'll see in a later lecture, dinosaurs did spend the vast majority of their life not as adults. And young tyrannosaurs, like this young Tyrannosaurus, are very lightly built animals. And you can sort of see their Coelurosaurian heritage much easier in these young individuals compared to great big honkers like these guys. This is Sue, one of the largest Tyrannosaurus rex specimens. And just to give you a sense of how big they are, that's me and the Pex rex specimen. And what makes a Tyrannosaurid a Tyrannosaurid? Well, in some ways, they've inherited ancestral traits for Tyrannosauroidea. They've got fused nasals and U-shaped premaxillary teeth. In these guys, there's also a gigantic skull size. The skull is disproportionately large for Tyrannosaurids. Of course, they also have gigantic body size, much larger than other Tyrannosauroids. Their teeth, the lateral teeth, are thick from side to side. We call incrassate. It's a specialized term, but it means thickened. Talk about those in a bit. They've got those dinky little arms with two-fingered hands. So it's reduced in two different ways. They have proportionally long and slender legs, and they end in this arctometatarsus. So most of these attributes I'll have in at least one slide about, but this gives you a sense of traits that make Tyrannosaurids distinctive compared to other large theropods. Also, Tyrannosaurids tend to have wider skulls. Most groups of large theropods actually have narrower skulls than people generally appreciate. But Tyrannosaurids have wider skulls. A consequence of that is that the orbits, there and there, are more forward-facing than in other large carnivores. And that gives Tyrannosaurids more of an overlap between the two eyes, so more binocular vision, more depth perception, or rather a wider range in which they have depth perception. Because to get depth perception, you need information from both eyes. So the big parentheses here is the width of human binocular vision, which is quite large because we have flat bases. So both our eyes can contact the same object for a huge area. Tyrannosaurids, not as much, but more so than other theropods, which are much narrower, to have an area with a good overlap. And if we compare the skull shapes of both a big tyrannosaur and a big allosauroid carnosaur, we see that Tyrannosaurid skulls are sort of more massively built. We flip them over, we look at the inside of the snout. As I talked about in the recording, primitive theropods tend not to have a secondary palate, or a solid palate where the maxillae meet in the middle. Tyrannosaurids do. So this gives them more strength between the fused nasals and a solid palate. They can grasp down and twist their skulls against the food that they're eating, more so than the other forms, which remember I talked about were sort of bite and slice. Bite and slice. In order to power that, the areas for the neck muscles in tyrannosaurs are much larger than they are in other comparable-sized carnivorous dinosaurs. These are shown essentially to scale. And you can see those arrows for muscle attachment much bigger in the tyrannosaurs than in the allosaur. Also, we saw that the typical theropod is zyphodont dentition, blade-like teeth, where the root is about 1/2 the total length, and the teeth are blade-like from side to side. Tyrannosaurid teeth, incrassate as it's called, are thick from side to side. They're not shaped like blades at all, despite the common, mouthful of steak knives, only it didn't. They were more like bananas. The joke is that it's like knife-edged bananas. And the root is actually twice as long as the crown, even though the crowns themselves were actually quite large. So this means that they're much deeper rooted and thicker. And that's a good tooth design to get stuck in something and twist back and forth, as opposed to a blade-like tooth, which is excellent for cutting, excellent for slashing, but you stick that into meat or bone, and you twist from side to side, it's more likely to snap. And I just want to point out here, the Spinosaurids also had teeth that were good for twisting around, but they're shaped differently. They're actually cone-shaped, as I talked about, and are also deeply rooted. So Tyrannosaurid teeth, it turns out, are actually better at bending in both the forward, backwards, and side-to-side motions that we get in feeding. Recent studies puts that the pressure at the tip of the tooth of a big Tyrannosaurus is about 1 gigapascal. That's sufficient to shatter bone. And in fact, the overall bite forces of Tyrannosaurus, of big adult Tyrannosaurus, are more than twice the bite force of the strongest bite force of any modern land animal, the saltwater crocodile, considerably bigger than the spotted hyena, which is the strongest bite of any land mammal today, almost twice the strength of a great white shark's bite. But to be fair, it is not the strongest bite in Earth history. There were giant extinct caimans, so a sort of alligator, that had a much stronger bite force than T-Rex, and the the giant megalodon shark, has the strongest bite force anyone has ever estimated for Earth history. So we have trace evidence of the bone-crushing ability of tyrant bites in the form of coprolites. This is a T-Rex turd, and inside it are these shattered fragments of digested ornithischian bones. We also have bones of animals that got away. For instance, this Edmontosaurus, who has a chunk taken out of its tail that matches a T-Rex bite, but it is subsequently healed, so we know it was alive when it was attacked. In this case, this Triceratops did not walk away. He was dead and fed upon. But we have some specimens of Triceratops, like this one, where the horn was bitten off, or parts of it were bitten off, and healed. So the evidence is that Tyrannosaurids used what we call a puncture and pull feeding technique. It wasn't just bite and slice. These guys punctured down into the food and sort of pulled and twisted about to rip out great big chunks of the victim. Gorgosaurus is an earlier Tyrannosaurid, earlier than T-Rex. So the puncture and pull feeding technique. And here we see it in action. Now, in contrast, the arms of Tyrannosaurus and other Tyrannosaurids are infamously weak. So they're essentially useless. It can't even do a slap bite because they can't even reach each other. Relative to other basal coelurosaurs, Tyrannosaur forelimbs are reduced in 2 ways. They're shorter. As you can see here, this is the holotype specimen of Tyrannosaurus rex. It couldn't even reach its teeth. It could not pick its teeth with those arms. And it's reduced the digit count. So we saw in the reporting that ancestrally Neotheropods have 4 fingers, Avitheropods have 3 fingers, Tyrannosaurids 2 fingers, digits 1 and 2. They've lost the function. They've lost digit 3. It's not actually going to be the most extreme reduction, but it is one of the most extreme reductions in terms of digit count. So yeah, there is a whole set of cartoons about the uselessness of tyrannosaur hands, tyrannosaur arms. I have a whole bunch of them. I'm not even going to be able to show you all of them. But here we actually see a hand bones of Tyrannosaurus. There's metacarpal 1. It's got a finger joint. Metacarpal 2, there's a finger joint. They actually still have metacarpal 3, but there's no finger joint, so there's no finger coming off of it. And that would just be within the palm of the hand. You wouldn't see it sticking out. So here we see these totally tiny, useless arms. And here I am giving it the Tyrannosaur gang sign as a young individual Gorgosaurus. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, Tyrannosaur arms might be short, but they're not weak. Well, it's all a matter of perspective. Some studies estimated that the resisting force, so sort of the curling strength at the elbow, is about 100 kilograms. That's 220 pounds. Now, if you or I could curl 100 kilograms, we'd be like in the Olympics, if not superheroes. But that's only 1.25% of the body mass of the individual. That'd be like me curling 2.5 pounds and saying I'm a big, strong guy because of that. So, yeah, no. It was strong relative to us. Those arms are wussy compared to the animal itself. But for all the jokes about them having these useless arms, okay, maybe they get around it. Let's keep in mind that bite force that they have. They didn't need big, big, strong arms when you have the strongest bite of any land animal of your time. Now, the hind limbs are also highly specialized. So, for their body size, Tyrannosaurids have elongate tibiae and especially elongate metatarsi. And most importantly, they have this what we call arctometatarsallian foot. That is a pinched third metatarsal. So what does that mean? If you look at a typical theropod foot, metatarsals 2, 3, and 4 are about the same width from top to bottom. And the whole foot is relatively broad. When we look at a tyrannosaurid foot, and they're close outgroups, the middle metatarsal is pinched out between 2 and 4 at the top, and it forms a wedge shape below, and the whole metatarsus is longer and more slender. So this word arctometatarsus means compressed metatarsals, or compressed metatarsus. Here's what if we separate it out. This is metatarsal 3 in a Daspletosaurus. Here we have it put in position with 2 and 4, and looking at it from above. So that middle bone is no longer primarily a weight-bearing bone, at least not at top. At the base it is, and it sort of shunts that weight onto the outside bones. And so we've been looking at the function of the metatarsus for, well, decades now. One thing it seems to do is act as a shock absorber, especially if there's a little bit of motion in it. So the foot compresses down, it absorbs some energy, it stores it, it releases it, and so it saves it using energy while running. Another aspect of it is it resists torsion. It resists twisting forces. So you can have a longer foot, which is useful for covering more ground per unit time, but still maintain function with turning. In fact, make it even better at turning than a typical theropod. Or more importantly, than a typical herbivore. Now, these are not the only group of theropods to evolve this arctometatarsus. We will see, and I'll have to do a recording for the ornithomimosaurs. It'll be a shorter recording. But they also evolve the arctometatarsus. They do so convergently. And the ornithomimids, the ostrich dinosaurs, have long been recognized as sort of the fastest of the Mesozoic dinosaurs. But if you spend decades collecting data on the hind limbs of theropods and other dinosaurs and plot them out, so this is metatarsus length as the y-axis, femur length, which is a good proxy of body size, as the x-axis, we see that Tyrannosaurids, who are in these orange squares, plot out, first of all, much longer metatarsi than other big theropods, and that the small Tyrannosaurids overlap in the same space as ornithomimosaurs, which are long regarded as the fastest of dinosaurs. So a young tyrannosaur would be up there among the fastest dinosaurs. But of course, it's more important to look not at just other large theropods, which is not the creatures they were encountering, but rather the animals like ceratopsids and hadrosaurids that they were in competition, or that they were in coevolution with. And it turns out that the tyrannosaurids had much longer metatarsi than hadrosaurids or ceratopsids. These other forms that they lived with were not speed adapted. I mean, they're probably good movers for a big herbivorous dinosaur, but that's damned by faint praise. And you don't have to be faster than a racehorse in order to catch creatures that were not running as fast as a racehorse. And tyrannosaurids were unquestionably faster than the duckbills and the horned dinosaurs. All right. Some recent work that we had come out a couple years ago actually looked at another issue of locomotion, which is agility, turning ability. And we found through a number of metrics that at any given body size, so that's the x-axis again, tyrannosaurids in blue were twice as agile as other theropods of the same body mass. So the long, slender foot combined with bigger hip muscles and a more concentrated body mass gave them a quicker ability to turn around, which makes sense against the animals that they'd be feeding on. Tyrannosaurids are chasing after and having to deal with horned dinosaurs and duckbills, which themselves would have been more agile than, say, a stegosaur or especially a sauropod that the Jurassic theropods and the early Cretaceous theropods had to deal with. And on the converse side, if you're trying to deal with these big walking walls of meat that are sauropods, being more stable might be an advantage when you're trying to do this bite and slice. Okay, so we'll be able to get the beginning of this at least, and then wrap up ornithomimosaurs online so we don't get too far behind. The next phase of coelurosaur evolution, we take a major detour in terms of life habits, because almost all the examples we had before were carnivores. But now we're going to have some changes. For one thing, the brain size doubles again relative to body size. In fact, for the first time ever in dinosaur history, as we're marching up the tree, the brains are big enough to leave an impression on the outside of the skull. You know, and a mammal skull and a bird skull, the shape of the skull is greatly controlled by the size of the brain underneath. In most lizards and crocodiles and so forth, it isn't. Same with most dinosaurs. But now we can actually see a bulge where the brain goes in these coelurosaurs. Also, at this phase, almost all the remaining ones, with a couple really notable exceptions, abandon a predatory lifestyle. And from this point on, most of them have teeth which are small, which are phylodont, leaf-shaped, rather than zyphodont. And they're often unserrated or have very large denticles, which we've seen in herbivorous dinosaurs is good for chopping up plants. Most of these forms have at least part of the jaw that's covered by a beak. In some cases, they lose all the teeth entirely. In many of these forms, the old grasping hands no longer are grasping. And as you can see from these drawings, the skulls are typically relatively small size compared to the body, if we compared that to, say, a primitive tyrannosauroid or a carnosaur or what have you. And these are all attributes with a shift away from a predatory lifestyle. Now, we've already encountered one group of non-predatory theropods, the Elaphrosaurines, which are a type of ceratosaur. We saw this critter, Chilesaurus, who knows where the heck it fits. But we're now going to move over, both in the recorded lecture, where I'll do about 10 minutes with ornithomimosaurs, and then Monday's lecture, which will cover these guys, as well as some predators. A whole phase of non-predatory theropods. So I'll end on this cartoon, but Even though they are no longer carnivores, they are still perfectly good theropods. So that is an asshole of a T-Rex who's dismissing his son because the son is now a herbivore. They're still theropods, still perfectly good theropods, even if they have abandoned a diet of meat. All right, so I will see you on Monday, and take care.